Hello, everyone. My name is Anastasia Gorokova. I'm a partner in the real estate team in the London office of Osborne Clarke. And I'm here today talking to my colleague, Jonathan Mills, who's an associate director in the real estate team, currently seconded to our New York office. And today we thought we would have a quick conversation about alternative residential assets and the role of community within those assets. And this is off the back of our most recent thought leadership piece that we have produced, which is called the Roadmap for Taking Alternative Residential Assets Mainstream. And in that report, we looked at community as being one of the factors that really needs to be emphasized and pushed forward in order for these operational assets to grow and thrive. And needless to say, over the last couple of months, that aspect of community has been highlighted ever more profoundly with all of us being in this lockdown. So Jonathan, if I could ask you the first question on this topic. So given that the US multifamily market is more well established than it is in the UK. I'm interested to know what you've been advising your clients, and particularly recently, your clients in the alternative residential space in relation to how they continue to provide that sense of community within their developments.
Thanks, Anastasia. Hi, everyone. As Anastasia said, I am on secondment over here in the US, so I've got some pretty useful insight and gained some useful market knowledge sort of as to how operators are addressing this issue here. Lockdowns really shone a spotlight on the whole community over a loneliness movement, and that concept and idea is more important now than ever. It's received a lot of press coverage over in the US. A lot of people actually actively coming out and saying that they stayed in certain multifamily or co-living developments for the community, even in spite of the pandemic, and even though it was very easy to frown upon density at this time, and you only have to look at rent collections across the spectrum of multifamily, and particularly community-driven areas of multifamily like co-living, to see that community is very much the way forward, and operators are very much trying to address it now if they hadn't previously. I think there are two strands that spring to mind here. One is that operators are reassessing the ways in which they build and foster community, and one of those is through recalibrating existing amenity space, either recalibrating what's there now or rethinking how they design buildings of the future and purpose-built buildings for all spectrums of multifamily. I guess an important legal strand that comes out of that is taking it back to your management agreement or your leasing agreement to ensure that the changes that you make, you're legally able to, and that you're permitted to without any further consents. And also cost and the impact of any amendments on CapEx obviously need to be carefully assessed as well. Another real topic of importance here is the use of technology and how that brings people together and drives community forward. I think the role of technology plays a key part in people's experience within their built environment. So functional technology is increasingly important now, and will become the key technology, the key staple of multifamily and alternative residential as a whole. So things like paperless leasing, virtual tours, things that really streamline the process, and particularly important now in the pandemic, and also how technology can look to drive community forward. So community apps, community platforms, things that empower the community and the residents to engage with and build their own community as well. And obviously something that concerns lawyers in particular is how the increased use of technology has an impact on the advice that we need to give and the advice that's important for our clients. And that's going to revolve around data protection, data management, ensuring that privacy policies are in place, patents and trademarks are there to preserve value in technology and brand that's been built over this important time. So I guess what I'd find interesting to hear from you, Anastasia, is how, although the market isn't as mature, how community is under the spotlight in the UK. Excuse me, in the UK, and what conversations you've been having with your clients.
So I think you're right. I think community isn't as, or the market rather, isn't as mature as in the UK. But what has been interesting over the last couple of months, particularly, is how much those community benefits of build-to-rent, co-living, and the other alternative residential assets have really just grown exponentially in importance. Because with all of us staying at home, working from home, that sense of who you're with, who's around you, how, you know, where you are, that your immediate community around you is ever more important. And really, I think, you know, we've in the UK, we've always had quite a sort of strong buy-to-let market, so sort of private landlords owning from anywhere from 1 to 100 flats and renting them out privately. But the difference with build to rent, for example, is that you're not, as a buy-to-let landlord, you're not responsible for creating that community, for putting people in a building together and making sure that they're all happy to be there, and they've got facilities and they're interacting, and there's that additional layer of sort of, you know, a mini little society that you're creating. You know, we've never really had that before. But of course, over the last few months, that's all that everybody's talking about is, you know, I've heard so many different fantastic initiatives from our various clients and other people in the market of what they're doing to bring those communities together in the current time, you know, from yoga classes in the courtyard and, you know, DJs, so everyone's enjoying things on their balcony, and, you know, all these different types of things are just, there's more and more, you know, the innovation, the creativity in that space is just, you know, is going through the roof, really. And on the technology front, again, you know, I think perhaps you could have said that the alternative residential market in the UK has been a little bit slower in you know, it's still more in its infancy than it is in the US. But one of the opportunities with that is to really leapfrog ahead with things like technologies, you know, to really use innovation, creativity to sort of spring forward, you know, further than we would have been, you know, previously, kind of using the current lockdown, the current situation as a way to get us there. So, but I think one of the key things that people are still realizing is that, yes, technology can sort of facilitate that community, but you need the right people to actually create that community. You need the right people in your developments, you know, the right front of house staff to really bring that community together, which then the technology can sort of underpin, if you like. But without the people, it doesn't. It's not the same experience. Would you agree with that from what you're seeing in the States?
Yeah, I completely agree. Actually, obviously, everybody's is aware there's a much more inbuilt and ingrained service culture in the US and across the US, but I think the right people are very much the drivers for the community and facilitators of community. The clients that I've spoken to don't like too much micromanagement and like the community to grow fairly organically, and I found that's the best way. But yes, the community can do it themselves, and the technology is beginning to allow that more and more. But I still think front of house and building staff as a whole are incredibly important. Just to touch on the technology point again briefly, our alternative residential report highlights sort of the use of technology across a full spectrum of alternative residential. Do you think it's applied sort of equally in all asset classes and facets of alternative residential, or is there any sort of areas where there's disparity and that more attention is needed possibly?
I think definitely, if you look at the senior living assets, and we've got clients in that space who have definitely highlighted to us that there is a technology underclass potentially at that end of the spectrum, because it's just, you know, it's not as easy to communicate with people in a senior living development through technology. They're not as comfortable with it, they're not as used to it. So one of the things that I've heard from one of our clients in that space is that during the height of the lockdown, particularly obviously if you look at that demographic, you know, people of a higher risk at that age, you've had actually managers and property managers actually moving into the development to look after the people. So rather than sort of staying away, and managing that development remotely or virtually, they've actually moved in because that's the only way to keep that sense of community going in those types of developments. So that's quite an interesting side, just to show that it's not one size fits all when it comes to technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to sort of start to bring this to a close, I guess one key question that I get asked a lot here, and something that our clients that are looking, our US clients that are looking to Europe and to understand certain parts of particularly the UK market better, is they're interested in the planning system and how that needs to respond to the want of operators to create and drive community.
I think that is one of the aspects of the system over here that is still very much criticised. A lot of people feel like it's not really fit for purpose when you look at alternative residential or these types of operational rental assets. It will be interesting to see whether the fact that these community benefits have been so highlighted over the last few months, particularly, whether policymakers and local authorities will see that. They'll see that these types of assets bring so much to a local, not just to that development, the people who live within that development, but to that whole local area, really, because it's those investors, those operators of those long-term income-driven assets that have more interest in that local area than your sort of more traditional for sale developer, because they don't have that long-term view. So when you look at sort of local workforce, local, I don't know, retail, local businesses, local charities, things like that, and bringing them in and widening that community from your development into that area, it's things like build to rent, co-living, student accommodation. It's those assets that will bridge that gap. And I think when local authorities really get on board with that properly and really get to see that and understand that, I think we'll hopefully start to see some really positive change coming down through the planning system. One other thing that will be interesting to keep an eye on is how key workers will be treated in the next sort of short to medium term and eventually long term, because one thing that has been highlighted quite clearly over the last few months is the importance of key workers, how much they do, and really the affordability gap, of somebody working in a central London hospital, let's say, but having to live very far out because it's just too expensive to rent, in town. So whether or not that will come through the planning system and there will be some provision for key worker accommodation, in central cities, particularly within sort of rental developments. That's another one to watch out for. And that'll be interesting to see how that comes through.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks.
So it's been great chatting to you, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for joining and listening in.
Thanks, everyone.